Okay, Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here, and welcome to a new video. Chapter 16, we're going to look at that, and the chapter title is The Ferment of Reform and Culture, and the key word here is reform. In antebellum America, we're still finishing up period 4 in our A-Push class. Okay, here's a quote from famous American Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1837, talking about America. We'll walk on our own feet, we'll work with our own hands, and we'll speak our own minds. And a lot of these reformers of this time period definitely spoke their own minds and wanted to make changes in America. And here are some of the key topics. We're going to talk about religion, a group called the Mormons, some of the reform movements, temperance, Seneca Falls Convention, and Utopian societies. We wanted to thank their musical introduction, Casey and the Sunshine Band with Shake, 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 Shake Your Booty. And we chose this song to honor one of the groups that like to shake it. I wonder what they call the people that like to shake it. Maybe shakers. Okay, the first section is reviving religion, and a couple of terms that you need to know. One is deism. Okay, deism is a belief in reason, science, rather than the Bible. So in America, this movement really began around the late 1700s, early 1800s, where this idea started to overcome many of the religious leaders. In fact, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, many historians say, were deists. They were not big religious people. In fact, Jefferson even, one of his favorite ideas was the separation of religion and government. So many of these deists also started a new church called the Unitarian faith. Okay, so Unitarian, they have the belief of the deists. And this new church really began in New England in the late 1700s. And many Americans who were strong religious people, especially Christians, really were worried about this movement. And so this causes a religious revival in the early 1800s in America called the Second Great Awakening. So highlight this term. We had the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was 100 years before this in the 1730s and 40s. The Second Great Awakening begins in the early 1800s, around these decades in America. So what is the result of this new religious revival? Well, the churches are reorganized into new groups and denominations. Just like the First Great Awakening, we have a breakup, a split in denominations. I would highlight this. Camp meetings become very popular in America. These were meetings of around up to 25,000 people. They would come and share the religious experience, show more emotion to each other. It's just a giant gathering for religious purposes. And I would also highlight this next part here. The Second Great Awakening did lead to many other reform movements. So a result of Second Great Awakening was more reform movements in America during antebellum America, and it's very important. And some of these reform movements that sprang up from the Second Great Awakening were prison reform, temperance, women's movement, and abolition. Okay, finishing up with the Second Great Awakening, I mentioned that the Methodists and Baptists, these Protestant religions gained many new members. So look at this graph down here, the growth of denominations. And so we have 6 denominations down here. We've got mostly Protestant denominations. We do have Catholics in here as well. And clearly that the blue and the green, which are the Methodists and Baptists, saw a drastic increase in the number of denominations beginning around the year 1820, which is kind of when the Second Great Awakening began. Also know this name right here, Charles Granderson Finney. He is probably the most famous Second Great Awakening preacher that you need to know. He was a big revivalist preacher during this time period, and there he is with a beard. Okay, denominational diversity. And so the Second Great Awakening did widen the gap between class and region. In the East, especially the Northeast, the Second Great Awakening was not as popular, did not affect quite as many people. Also in the Northeast, in the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Unitarians were not as affected by it very much. And these religions mostly were the wealthier. However, the the Methodists and Baptists were mostly in the South and West, and most of them were more the poorer classes attended these denominations. The Second Great Awakening eventually does cause a split, especially by the 1830s, 1840s, between Northern and Southern Baptists, and also the Northern and Southern Methodists, because slavery is becoming an issue by the 1830s in America. And this issue is actually going to split these churches between sectional lines. And so the saying goes, once the first church is split, then the parties split, such as the Whigs and Democrats, and then finally the Union split, the Civil War. Okay, a desert, Zion in Utah. We're going to talk about the Mormons. Okay, the founder of the Mormons is Joseph Smith. I would highlight that. This is also called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church, is sometimes its initials, but we commonly call them just the Mormons. And this religious group faced strong opposition from non-Mormon groups. They were not very wanted because they were different than most other religious groups. And so the Mormons began in New York in an area called the Burned Over District. I would highlight this. The Burned Over District is where the Second Great Awakening was probably at its peak. There was so much emotion going on in this region. And so that's why they call this area of New York the Burned Over District. And so the Mormons actually did begin in this area. Then, because of persecution, they moved to Ohio, and then more persecution in Missouri, then Illinois, because people did not like their religious views. And so Joseph Smith and his brother eventually is murdered. They are murdered by a mob in Illinois in 1844, so their leader's done. But fortunately for the Mormons, a man named Brigham Young, he takes over the religious group, and he leads them out west to Utah to avoid the further persecution. Brigham Young, interesting character. He had 26 wives and 56 children. So that's a lot more than most people, and so they did practice what is called polygamy, which was frowned upon by other Americans at the time. And polygamy is having more than one wife. And so this kind of hinders the Mormons in terms of getting respect in America. And it's partially why Utah was not allowed into the Union as a state until the year 1896 because of this practice. But overall, the Mormons did prosper in Utah. Okay, so one of the key things, the Second Great Awakening, one of the biggest results is that this religious revival impacted many reform movements. And these are the five that we're going to talk about over the rest of chapter 16. Okay, so the first reform is education. So free schools for free people. So public education, free schools becomes more popular 1825 to 1850. And this early education system had the little red schoolhouse, one room, one teacher, one stove, and many lower grades. Unfortunately, the teaching was not very good early on, but that does improve with more training. And the person who we associate with public schools is Horace Mann. So I would highlight him of Massachusetts. He was like the father of public education. So he wanted to see improvements with education because he felt education is the key to get you to where you want to be. Also, more improvements in education. I would just know these two things. The Noah Webster, I'd highlight him of Connecticut. He does improve the American language with the Webster's Dictionary, which is important, which is still very important today in our society. And then William McGuffey, he created the McGuffey Reader. So I'd highlight this, and this was created in the 1830s and continued throughout our history, and it was a reader for grade school kids. So it was like one of the first books to help kids with education. It sold millions of copies, and many of his ideas were for patriotism, morality, and idealism to instill in the youth of America. Okay, more education reforms. Now we're going to talk about colleges, and in this section, there's nothing that you really need to know. Near the top, North Carolina was the first public college. Thomas Jefferson was big into independence of religion and politics. Women did get to see some gains early on in antebellum America in terms of having colleges. Again, I don't think you need to know these two, but I would highlight this, the Lyceum movement. Okay, and this begins in the antebellum America, 1830s, 1840s. And the Lyceum movement was traveling lectures around the country, basically helping to educate people. The learning to the masses is what is said. So everybody get a chance to learn from these intelligent people who would go around the country giving lectures to educate people. And the most famous one was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He'd go around the country on this Lyceum movement to try to educate the public. Okay, as we mentioned, this time period in antebellum America is an age of reform caused mostly by the Second Great Awakening. And so we talk about the different reform movements, the rights for women, communal living, or utopian societies. So these are some of the reform movements. Also, some societies were formed against the drinking of alcohol, tobacco, profanity. So we had all these different groups forming to try to change America for the better. And I would highlight this. The most successful and probably most important reform movement was abolition. Okay, they were able to make the most changes, especially when the Civil War comes around. Our author says they were crack-bang cranks, some of these reformers, but overall, most of the reformers were intelligent people. They had ideals that they wanted to instill in America, and they did make change. Ideas, beliefs, and culture, that's your theme. And one of the early reformers I want you to know is Dorothea Dix. Okay, Dorothea Dix is very huge, very important in APUSH. She improved conditions for criminals and the mentally ill. So she was big in trying to make the prison and penal institutions better, because she witnessed some of the terrible conditions that these people in prisons were in, and she fought to give them more humane conditions to live in. Okay, another reform movement besides prison reform was the prohibition or temperance movement. Let's call this the temperance movement of the early 1800s. Actually, it continues throughout the 1800s in America. And this section is Demon Rum, the Old Deluder. Eventually, this movement does become a success when we have prohibition in America in the 1920s. But anyway, the believers in the temperance movement believe that alcohol caused major problems in society. There was accidents in work, poor efficiency of labor. It was difficult on family, abuse. So definitely a lot of negatives with alcohol. And so many Americans wanted to change that. And so I would highlight this. One of the early American reform groups was called the American Temperance Society. And here's the keyword temperance. It was founded in 1826 in Boston. But this group wanted to try to end alcohol in America because of its many problems. There was a little bit of early success with the temperance movement people, especially at the state level. Maine did pass a law trying to limit the amount of alcohol, and many other states did pass prohibitionary laws. But it wasn't until we had the 1920s when we had national prohibition. Okay, this is called the Drunkard's Progress cartoon. This is a piece of propaganda that was created in 1846 by the temperance movement people. And basically, they said when you drink too much alcohol, there's 9 steps. So here are the 9 steps, not going to all of them, but basically you start with a glass with a friend, then you have a bold chat, and eventually, the more alcohol you drink, all this is going to lead to your death. So, and also look underneath here. It's so interesting. You have the mom and a child looking very sad, walking without their father because he became an alcoholic and eventually died. And so this is pretty harsh, but it just shows how the temperance movement tried to end alcohol in America. All right, let's talk about some feminists, some women in revolt. And the early feminist movement begins in antebellum America, and you must know this, okay? 1848, this is so important. The Seneca Falls Convention in the state of New York. It's a huge women's rights convention, and they create the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. Highlight this. So this women's convention basically has a declaration. We had a declaration in America, a Declaration of Independence. This is for women, okay, what they were unhappy with. And you must know some key leaders, okay? Beamer, how many of these do I need to know? You need to know at least a few of them. You should definitely know that these early feminists included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. I think those are must-knows. But sometimes you see others such as the Grimke sisters, Lucretia Mott. These were early feminists that wanted to see more equality for women. And probably the biggest thing they wanted, besides equality, they wanted that is the right to vote. And so they fought for that. And unfortunately for the women's movement, they did not get full suffrage until 70 years later. And many of these feminists also joined other reform movements. Many of them, there's like a crossover of some of them. Many of them also became abolitionists as well to end slavery in America. All right, the final slide, wilderness utopias. A utopia is an idealist society, okay, or a perfect world, and these were some weird groups, okay. Some of them had idealists, some maybe were they socialists. Their goal of these utopian experiences was to create the perfect society or a better society for their followers. And so here are 4 here that I just want you to be aware of. And so Robert Owen, New Harmony, created this in Indiana. It was a communal society. They tried to live away from the rest of the world. It was short-lived. Okay, I think these 3 are a little bit more important. Brook Farm was Massachusetts, a 5-year utopian society. And this is where a lot of the transcendentalists live. Okay, but they did not end up working out too well. The transcendentalists such as Emerson and Thoreau went to Brook Farm to try to make it a success, but did not. Maybe the weirdest of them, well, actually there's a lot of weird ones, but the Oneida community. Okay, this was also in the state of New York, 1848. Their leader was John Humphrey Noyes, and this utopian community practiced free love, birth control, and suppression of selfishness, and it did last a longer time, almost 30 years. And so the biggest thing is they would have free love, and I'll just leave it at that. Moving on. But eventually Oneida becomes a success in terms of making steel traps and also just like making silverware. Maybe you've heard of the Oneida collection. It's still around today. They become a very prosperous business enterprise. And the final utopian society are the Shakers. Shake, shake, shake. The Shakers, they had a 150-year period, a utopian group, and they had the height of their movement was up to 6,000 members by 1840. And their beliefs, I don't know how to describe, but they were different. They had strict segregation of the sexes, so men and women were completely opposite and stayed away from each other. They didn't reproduce as well. They're prohibited for marriage and sexual relations. So the only way they could continue was by recruiting more people into their society, and they did. And they did like to dance. I don't think it was like a Hudsonville dance necessarily, but they did have dances where they would have some gatherings. But they did prohibit marriage and sexual relations. Slightly off topic, when I see this term, I think of Bill Clinton because he had a famous quote saying that he did not have sexual relations with that woman, and he lied. And then he was impeached, which is probably not a good thing for a president.